Sitting around idle, waiting for the top of the hour to start. So I'd like to welcome everybody. Thanks for taking some time if you're at YSU. Thanks for taking time out at the end of a very, very busy semester, very, very busy week at a busy semester. Really appreciate you being here. We thought that it was important at YSU that we talk a little bit about East Palestine, the trade derailment, what that might mean for us here in Youngstown, in Northeast Ohio, what that could mean beyond. In that regard, we've got a lot of professionals that could have sat at this table and given their input and their knowledge and their intake on what was here, but we sort of trimmed it through to the social sciences and economics today, the environmental science realm. Know that there's much that we can't talk about today because this is in litigation, so our panel members who are involved in that or have expert knowledge in that can't divulge any of that information. There's also some proprietary research that are going on, or works that are going on still where the knowledge base hasn't yet been settled. Things are still under investigation, so those things can't be discussed as well today. But for the most part, we're going to give you as much information on what our experts have to share with you this evening. Maybe answer some questions, hopefully give you some more things to think about in terms of the importance of events like this and what it means to us here in this part of Ohio, this part of North America, and certainly globally as we have witnessed over the last several weeks more and more trade derailments happen, but there are also other hazard impacts that have parallel considerations that we might want to put some thought to. So with that, I am more than pleased to say that everybody at this table is from YSU. Our expert panel that are our folks that are out in the field are all YSU graduates, and then I've got two faculty members. So at the far end there, I have Robert Ritchie, who is with the Port Authority in Columbiana. I've got Ryan Bullocky from WKNB. Mackenzie, because I'm so nervous about it, and she's got a new last name that is new to me, is Villatora. She's with the Portage County, and then AJ Summel, who is in economics, and then Brian Bottom in history. So that's who we've got with us today. I'm going to start out with AJ, then we're going to move through to Ryan, then Mackenzie, Bobby, and then we're going to round up our discussion with Brian. So I'm going to turn it over to my panel. Thanks so much.
Okay. All right, well, thank you, Donna, for putting this together. I think it's really important for local universities to host multidisciplinary forums on important topics like this, and what happened in East Palestine is certainly an important event in this area. And so I'm an economics professor here at YSU, and so first I'd say I can't speak about the environmental or the health impacts associated with the train derailment, because obviously that's just not part of my expertise. And so what I would speak about are the expected potential estimates as far as economic impact, kind of back of the envelope calculations as far as what we can expect as far as the damages to the community, potential property value impacts, use past cases as a point of comparison or reference, and then lastly talk a little bit about policies that could be put in place to try to prevent this from happening in the future. And so when it comes to, well, the economic impacts, I'd start by saying first that the actual environmental and health effects associated with the train derailment are in large part not relevant when it comes to how it affects the economy and the community. And I say that just meaning that with markets, all that matters is the perception. That if people feel like there could be some type of contamination, then that will be reflected in market prices. And so it means that even if there is no contamination, so if Norfolk Southern actually does follow through and fully remediate everything, and there's absolutely no actual concern associated with potential health impacts, I'm not saying that there is, but if that were to be the case and it were verifiable, it still would impact the community and it still would impact property values in the long term because of the stigma effect associated with the fact that this happened and it received a huge amount of media attention and would be associated with the town of East Palestine for a long time in the future. And so when it comes to measuring or estimating what the economic impacts might be, some of it is kind of obvious and more direct. And so kind of the obvious direct costs associated with the derailment, kind of that are just not in dispute and easily observable, are those costs associated with the cleanup and remediation, the expenditures related to the evacuation in terms of having people stay in lodging and pay for their food, expenditures related to public administration, like to police and firefighters, and the extra payments in terms of overtime that the government has had to incur. Then it's more implicit, but still kind of easily estimated, would be things like loss of income, which means, for businesses that were affected, employees that were affected in East Palestine, the income that they would have earned had the derailment not happened. So that foregone income that people who could not work due to the derailment and to the shutdown in the community, that is an obvious cost that is associated with it. The cost to the businesses that can no longer operate or still not operating in many cases. These are, I'd say, just indisputable, right? Because they are either directly incurred or obviously measurable in terms of, well, I was working, I was earning this amount, and now I'm no longer working and I'm not earning this amount. And so the fact that they are easily estimated means, well, that Norfolk Southern can never dispute that we're not responsible for this, and they're not disputing that they're not responsible for it. It's actually already been estimated. There was a paper that came out from Cleveland State recently that estimated those direct costs, which included the expenditures related to the evacuation, cleanup, public administration, and the loss of foregone income. It's already been estimated to be approximately $13 million, and that was really the end of March. So it's obviously already higher. So that's a pretty significant figure. But that does not include the impact to property values in the community. And those impacts to property values, those are longer term impacts, because even if the community is safe and there's no contamination, the impact to property values is based on, well, the willingness of people to continue to move into that community. And so when it comes to this, as I said, it's based on the perception and the potential concerns over long-term impacts and health effects. And so there's a decline in home values, eventual potential foreclosures and property abandonment, rental impact in terms of impact to landlords. A back of the envelope calculation, so there's approximately 2,200 housing units in East Palestine that have a median value of 90,000, had a median value of 90,000 prior to the derailment. So if you just take that 2,200 housing units times 90,000, it's approximately $200 million in terms of total property value in East Palestine. Other studies have shown that when there is an environmental contamination nearby, there's approximately a 10% decline in property values long term, where long term would be about 5 years. So and that varies widely based on the severity of the environmental contamination, other attributes as far as like how big the area is in terms of population size, whether it's a rural area, whether it was growing previously, could be as high as 30 or even 40% if it's a serious environmental spill, as this was, and in an area that's more rural and that has not been growing, has either been stagnant or declining. So if it were, okay. Okay, I'll try to wrap it up. So even if it were just 10%, that's a $20 million impact to property values. If it's as high as 30%, then that's a $60 million. Just a couple quick other points. The only other, I'd say, really comparable situation that happened in Paulsboro, New Jersey in 2012. Not as serious in terms of the amount, but there was a 12-mile evacuation. It happened, Conrail was the company that was responsible for it. They paid for the cleanup and remediation, gave residents compensation, similar to what Norfolk Southern's response is. Norfolk Southern's is $1,000 per resident. Conrail, they give $500. But more than a decade later, residents still feel the impact. And the mayor was recently quoted as saying, the stigma will stick around for quite a few years. I know this because it did here. If you look at what happened specifically to property values in Paulsboro, New Jersey, the median sales price fell by about 15%. And it stayed about 15% lower for 5 years after that spill. So the stigma, I mean, in this case, I'd say it didn't receive nearly the level of media attention in Paulsboro, New Jersey as this did. So, so it's potentially longer. And then but then it actually, property values did rebound. 5 years later, they were at what they were prior, and they've been tracking what's been happening in the rest of New Jersey in terms of percentage changes since. So, so I guess a more optimistic view, I mean, just basing it on Paulsboro, is that there will be a significant decrease in property values, potentially more than 15%, but in 5 years, hopefully things will be relatively back to what they were prior to the train derailment.
Let me pass it over to Ryan, I'll look for WKND.
WKBN.
Oh, you know what, that's how I write it down.
That's, it was, yeah, no worries at all. Okay, so I'm used to standing while speaking, so I'm going to do that, and I have some stuff over here on the computer as well. So I'm with WKBN. My primary role at the station, I typically am one of the meteorologists there, and my interest in this obviously came from, I was working that night, tracking this as it was, taking place, and also, my father's a retired railroad brake inspector, so when this happened, obviously, it's something we've talked about, and we discussed, we were talking about like how a train can derail, and one of the things that he had said is we began hearing through that weekend, oh, there's video, there's images of this on fire going through different communities. His suspicion was that it was an overheated wheel bearing, which is what the NTSB has been looking into. So that just kind of got the gears turning. I started digging into some stuff. I actually partnered with, which she's on the other side of the room, that's Jennifer Rodriguez, one of our digital reporters at the station covering this tonight. But her and I kind of partnered up on digging into what are the laws that are tied in with those bearings? What are the regulations that are in place? So we'll talk a little bit about what that's already playing as it shouldn't be. We'll talk a little bit about what we found with that, but I want to go to obviously the most impactful night. That was the night of the controlled burn. So we had at the station, it was kind of an all hands on deck. And this is a picture that I took off of one of our screens because it paints a picture of one of the things that we were looking at that day. So when the derailment happened, we started sending crews down there, trying to get the information out. What's happening, what's going on. We're getting pictures in of just huge flames in the sky. And obviously all the fire departments and municipalities rush down there is something that, our EMA representatives can address and whatnot. But for us, we were also there trying to get that information and figure out what was happening. It became apparent that this was more than just a fire. This was, chemicals involved and whatnot, as we then began hearing of evacuation orders, stay in shelter in place orders. So the day they did the controlled burn, we were all hands on deck covering them. This is one of the images that I captured, and what it shows is you can kind of see how the smoke plume, it rises up and then it spreads out. The concern that we had that day that they did that, from our perspective in the weather department, was there was an inversion setting up in the atmosphere, which what that means, there's a layer of warmer air up above that's going to prevent that from completely lifting up and dispersing out. That's why it kind of stops and spreads out. It's being blocked from going any higher. That night, that inversion was supposed to start coming down, and the winds were going to be shifting. Later this evening, what ended up happening, we started getting calls into our newsroom about a smell of chemicals in the air, chlorine that night. This was a picture, as we started getting those, that I snapped from our weather camera that's atop the Oak Hill building in Youngstown, overlooking downtown. That is, as we were getting these reports of smells coming in, Mahoning County mobilized their hazmat team, went out and started dispersing sensors around as this was coming through. We've not been able to get a straight answer of what we could have been in that plume, what ultimately could happen from that having gone through. One of the things that we've been trying to dig into, and we've been coming up to a standstill on that. I brought this image to the attention of the governor. He was at our station. I showed it to him. I sent it to their representatives. One of the concerns that we started diving into after looking at this was the presence of dioxins, which are considered to be, which maybe somebody can address that, one of the most toxic chemicals around. That's my understanding of it. I'm not a chemist at all. I don't know, so don't quote me on that. But basically, that was one of the things that we were dealing with that night. So then my curiosity started digging into, as people were asking, water supplies. That's one of the biggest concerns for especially the folks in East Palestine who, if I turn my faucet on, am I going to be drinking chemicals? So we started looking into those questions, which led us to a couple of discoveries there. This was the story that we worked on and put together discussing water supply. So what we had found, that train traveled all the way across Columbiana County. And in doing so, it went through multiple, what's referred to as a water source protection area. That's an area where it's considered especially concerning if chemical spills happen or contaminants in the ground, say ruptured septic tank or something like that. The implication in those areas is that pollutants that enter the ground in those regions can reach the water intake within 1 year's time if you're in the inner management zone. So this train traveled directly through a few of those. This is the story that we pieced together on that, which we'll see.
Dean's municipal water supply has been watched very closely for any sign of change. Now, the train traveled through several communities and through several drinking water supply protection areas before derailing. WKBN digital reporter Jennifer Rodriguez and Storm Team 27 meteorologist Ryan Hillicky looked into some of the vulnerable water supplies.
A difference in just about a mile sooner in the location of the February 3rd derailment, and the water situation could have been drastically different. If the chemicals would have entered the ground further up the track, they would be in what is called the inner management zone for East Palestine's water supply.
An EPA report says a spill in that zone, quote, poses a greater threat to the drinking water, and that the area, quote, warrants more stringent protection. The new rules and regulations don't come easy.
Shortly after the East Palestine disaster, I reached out to former administrator of the Federal Railroad Administration, Sarah Feinberg, to get her take on the situation unfolding. She said legislating fixes for issues that caused the derailment would be both challenging and timely for the FRA.
This rulemaking process, this regulatory process that you have to go through showing the costs, showing the potential benefits, showing the lives that will be saved, accounting for all of that is really a long process that ends up whittling down any kind of safety regulation into a regulation that is certainly better than, better than not having one, but it's generally not as strong as any safety regulator would like.
Feinberg said the fastest way for change is acts of Congress. Now, legislations intended to address railroad safety have already been proposed, but none of them take into account water supplies. We don't know the full scope of potential groundwater impacts in East Palestine, but the location where the chemicals spilled could have been even worse. An EPA water assessment for East Palestine released before the derailment states, quote, East Palestine's source of drinking water has a high susceptibility to contamination because of the lack of a protective layer of clay and the presence of significant potential contaminant sources in the protection area.
About a mile down these tracks is where the derailment happened, but where I am standing is within the municipal water supply's intermanagement zone. Now, in the ground below me, there is little clay or anything to stop contaminants that are introduced into the ground in this location from seeping down to the groundwater. According to an EPA assessment, contaminants that enter the ground in this location could reach the town's well intakes within 1 year's time.
This is what that protection area looks like. As you can see, the Norfolk Southern rail line runs directly through it. Had February's derailment happened just a mile sooner, East Palestine's water supply could have been in greater danger. Here's what Water Superintendent Scott Wolf says of groundwater flow near the derailment.
I'm gonna jump ahead here a little bit because I know that was my time warning there, but I want to show you quickly the other communities that I had found. One is in New Waterford. Very similar assessment that the water supply there is at a greater risk of contamination. They get their water from underground wells, and the train track itself runs right through
of significant
that
potential
intermanagement zone as well.
The train travels right through their intermanagement zone too.
But
Ground
we
contaminants
know
in this
that
area
was
are
actually on
expected
fire
to
already
reach
as
the
it
well
came through
intake
here.
within 1 year's
And what
time.
we had discovered in our investigation, what they used to detect that issue with the wheels, it's something called a hot bearing detector. It's basically sensors that are put along the tracks. There's a couple different ones. One of them is a dragging equipment detector. And there was a 20-mile stretch from when it passed through. There were 3 in Columbiana County that it went through. One is technically Mahoning County in Sebring. One of those is in Salem. And then one was in East Palestine just before it derailed. And there used to be, in Columbiana, a dragging equipment detector. We both pressed them for answers about where that was, why it was no longer functioning. What they told us was that it was left over from a previous operator of that rail line, which basically was, I believe it was Conrail, and it was some type of consolidation that happened following a bankruptcy. They had to divest it because the government can't own it if it makes a profit. And so that's when Norfolk Southern took it over. They said to us that that was left over and likely decommissioned years ago, but one of the things that we were looking into is there are reports to us that are unconfirmed, so we can't say this definitively, that they had operated that at one point, but then stopped, and it's possible if one was there, maybe they could have detected this. Since then, which something that happened after we started calling them, within a month's time, there is now one of those hot bearing detectors in Columbiana and also one of those dragging equipments. But the legislation is working its way through multiple different branches of government in the state at the federal level, although for when it comes to water supply, there really isn't anything in them that I have seen that would require placement of those in regard to people's drinking water or populated communities moving forward.
Excellent. Mr. Ryan? All right. Kenzie, I'm going to let you follow that up. I see lots and lots of overlap with conversation that we can follow up with here in a little bit.
So hello everyone, my name is Mackenzie Villatoro and I am the Emergency Management Specialist for the Portage County Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. Try to say that 5 times fast. But our jobs as emergency managers is to prepare for, prevent through planning, respond, recover, and mitigate from disasters. Some of our roles and responsibilities as emergency managers include opening of the Emergency Operations Center. So if we do have an event such as the derailment, it is likely that what we know as the incident commander, whether that be a law enforcement official or a fire department official, asking us to open up our EOC. And all of the EOC does is it brings partners across multiple disciplines, whether that be our public works partners, recovery partners, health and human services, emergency management, logistics, and so on and so forth. We bring everybody to the table so we're operating in the same room, face to face, and we're able to send out information to the media through media releases and host press conferences as we see fit. One of my jobs as our emergency management specialist is to help facilitate what we know as our local emergency planning committee. The LEPCs, there's one in every county in the state of Ohio. They oversee all of the hazmat or hazardous material items within the county. And that also includes preparing and maintaining a hazardous materials plan. That is something that we review on an annual basis. It's sent to our state partners for further review. And then once we get that golden stamp of approval, we enter into an exercise cycle. So these exercises are testing what we have compiled in our plans. We go from tabletop discussions, like we would here today, and then we go into a functional exercise where we're testing one piece of the plan, and then that brings us to full-scale exercises, which that tests 5 to 8 items of the plan. So whether that be activating our hospital systems, the way that our first responders actually respond to the events, the scene assessments, our health and safety of our first responders. And that really helps us to acknowledge where we have gaps in our response mechanisms. It also helps to bring to light where we need to designate trainings for future specialty teams. But that also gives us a basis on what to plan for. In my county specifically, we had done a commodity flow study back in 2018, and we had participants from the different rail companies, including the CSX company as well as Norfolk Southern, to get information on what is actually traveling through our communities. So since the derailment, our organization has been pretty proactive. We're interested in updating our commodity flow study just because of the turnover in industry and the turnover in personnel over the last 5 years. The number of chemical facilities that are transparent with our organizations. So one of the responsibilities of the LEPC is to receive chemical inventory reports from facilities within the county. So for Portage County, we have about 130 chemical facilities that report to us every year prior to March 1st, and they provide us what chemicals are on their property, how much, where it comes from, contact information, where it's located at in the facility. And this is all public record as well. So this all falls under the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, also known as EPCRA. And so for myself and my husband, when we were purchasing our first home, I actually did a public records request to find out what chemicals were in my community. And this is something that we all can do. You may find facilities that do have high hazards, may have some confidentiality agreements or proprietary items that they can't share, but they can give you some baseline information. Another thing that our LEPC does is we actually go out and inspect these facilities. It's one thing to report your chemical inventories, but are you really following your guidance? So our team goes in to these facilities. It's typically comprised of a law enforcement official, somebody from our local fire departments, our hazardous materials team coordinator, as well as myself as the information coordinator, our chairperson, and our emergency coordinator. And we have a discussion with these chemical facilities asking where their chemicals are coming from. So we kind of do an internal commodity flow study, but we also ask what are your mitigation measures do you have in place? Do you have areas, if there is a release within your facility, do you have somewhere for this material to go? Do you have a response team internally? Are you going to rely on your local first responders? In the last year, we had facilitated about 7 of these site-assisted visits, and we found that all of the facilities that we had visited last year were compliant with the regulations under EPCRA. Now we are actually preparing for the construction of a new facility in the city of Ravenna. It's called LG Chem. They have some pretty ugly chemicals, to put pretty blank. And one of our biggest areas of concern is that a lot of our critical infrastructure is right next to this facility. Our hospitals there, our VA clinic is right around the corner. Local law enforcement and police departments, that's the same thing. Law enforcement and fire departments are right around the corner, as well as some school systems. So one of the actions that we're taking as a preventative or preparedness approach is to develop a local emergency response plan to that facility specifically. But for the most part, we coordinate with all of our partners on an annual basis, whether that be training, some of our other plans that we have in our emergency operations plan, not just our hazardous materials plan. But it's a great field to get into. It's never boring, honestly. And it's always changing, seeing us go from a train derailment to a tornado or a flood. And we're constantly out there trying to build partnerships with people that we may be working with in times of crisis or during a disaster that's ongoing.
Thank you.
I have a quick question. The facility going into Ravenna, are they looking at implementing a local emergency response and hazmat team on site because of the logistics of the community?
I would believe so. I've been in contact with one of the gentlemen that's on the construction team, or who's going to be there for a point of contact. And they are a fairly large facility globally, so it's likely that they'll have an on-site hazmat team or HAZWOP or trained people.
Excellent. Thanks. We'll definitely have lots of time for questions at the very end of the report. So I will pass it over to Bobby. Thank you very much. I appreciate the question though.
I'm Bobby Ritchie. I'm with the Columbiana County Port Authority. My title is economic. I'm a recovery coordinator. So my position actually kind of started out of the pandemic. I started with the Port Authority in 2020. Right in the height of the pandemic, we realized that a lot of our businesses were not getting the assistance that they needed, whether that was help paying their bills, or now a few years later, there's issues with trying to get employees to some of these manufacturers and small businesses. So my position kind of really got heightened after the derailment. In fact, right prior to the derailment, about a month and a half, we really looked at the village of East Palestine, and we wanted to take our business retention and expansion program and move it into East Palestine and see how we can help those businesses out there. So December of 2022, we were meeting with the administration in East Palestine and just kind of discussing how can we help your businesses? What businesses can we kind of walk through the door, sit down, discuss with them what issues they're facing. And when the time came to start looking at that, really implementing that strategy in 2023, the derailment happened. So everything that we had planned business-wise completely changed. The economic trajectory of the village completely changed. So really, these businesses that could have been going through growth mode and sustainability, they are now in recovery mode. And that's where we're kind of coming into play. We're trying to help them as economic developers. Prior to this, this is not really something that we would have ever planned for. We're working with these manufacturers, these small businesses that are in downtown, trying to figure out, do they need a piece of equipment? Are they looking at a building expansion? Those are the type of things that we look at. So train derailment, not really something that we've ever really planned for, and it's not something as economic developers that we could plan for, especially in a smaller county like Columbiana. So initially after the impact, we started sitting down with the village administration, figuring out what their needs were. We kind of did a needs assessment immediately and figured out what they needed economically. And we started reaching out to our state and local partners, Jobs Ohio, our Team Neo branch of Jobs Ohio from Northeast Ohio. We started working with them. We immediately started putting together a survey and sending it out to businesses large and small, figuring out what their needs were, how they were impacted, where they could see this impacting them into the future. It's hard to tell right now, but we were already starting to get a lot of information in through those surveys, and we've sent out dozens of surveys, gotten dozens more back, giving us an idea of how these businesses are being impacted. So what we are doing now is we're taking those surveys and we're giving them back to Team Neo, Jobs Ohio. Again, there's no plan in place for something like this, but in the months after, we're working on something to try to assist these businesses because they really are being impacted. So right now at this point, we're putting together meetings with businesses, sitting down with them individually, figuring out what we can do to assist them. But I know as an economic recovery, it's going to be a long road for East Palestine, but we are working with them every step of the way to try to figure out how we can assist. And it's hard being a smaller entity. We only have about 3 people on staff, so we're definitely trying to help out where we can. And the challenges are from a large business that has invested a lot of money into the town. We're worried about how are we going to be able to help them so that they can stay. To some of the smaller businesses who have online presence, so they may not be as impacted as much. So there's depending on the company and their background, they are being impacted differently. So that's something that we have to take into account too. So it doesn't matter if they're a large business, small business, they have different needs at this point that we need to address. That's a little bit of my breakdown on East Palestine. I know I'm a little early.
No, hardly early. Yeah, you really spot on job. With that, then let me bring it to Brian. Thanks very much, Brian.
So you got out before the bell, I think I can do the same thing. So I teach environmental history here, and environmental history is basically a discipline that asks 3 questions. My presentation is going to be a bit more generalizing and contextualizing. Environmental history asks what are the ways in which nature has impacted the development of human societies. It asks how have we impacted nature in return, and it asks what are all the things that we've thought about, written about, legislated, organized to deal with our interactions with nature. And in every environmental history textbook, every time I've taught the course, there's always going to be some part of the semester in which we talk about some environmental disasters. And I'm a Russian historian primarily, so the ones I pick tend to be things like Chernobyl and the destruction of the Aral Sea and things like this. But whatever the scale of the disaster is, and I'd certainly include the East Palestine train derailment in this, there tends generally to be some very common features in every single case, and I wanted to draw attention to some of those. There's too many for me to go over all of them. But in every case, in a very general sense, it always is a moment when we kind of stop and think a little bit more seriously than we sometimes generally do about the costs and the benefits of our technologies and the way we organize our societies and so on. The chemicals that were being transported, the vinyl chloride and things like this, they provide products that we use, they provide jobs, they provide many benefits to us. But they also present costs, right? There are harms and damages that are done by all these things. And typically we don't really think about them that much, we don't notice them very much, but when there's a sudden disaster like this, it kind of focuses the mind. And we tend to ask a little bit more, think a little bit more about the implications of the technologies we have, the downsides as well as the upsides. Another thing that's very common to all of them, and it's already starting to be the case with the East Palestine situation, is that the more we look into the situation, the more we'll find potentially that there were corners cut, there were costs cut, that there were warning signs, that there were people who suggested that maybe there's a problem coming down the line and it gets pushed off and so on. So that's another thing that we tend to do. Corporations certainly tend to do it, but people tend to do it as well. We kind of are aware of some of the risks, but we tend to kind of push them off until they become very apparent. Maybe a bit more specifically too, it always seems to be the case, and I guess it's kind of makes sense. First responders are generally trained to deal with things that happen frequently, building fires and road accidents and so on. So whether it's Chernobyl or East Palestine or any other one that I've looked at, there's always this common pattern where the people who go in first generally don't really have a great sense of what it is that they're dealing with. They don't have the equipment for it, they don't have the knowledge for it, and so there's this kind of improvised response. People do the absolute best they can, and first responders take huge risks as well, very clearly. And then over time, we start to realize that maybe this should have been done this way, and maybe that should have been done that way, and things start to get second guessed and so on. Environmental historians often look, and I think, I guess this is kind of an invitation to my students who are here and to others, as we start to sort of look at this more in depth. There are reasons why those particular chemicals were on that particular train, and why that particular rail line was used, and why that line is where it is, and so on. So there's a whole kind of, I guess it's sort of a detective story to be uncovered about the specifics of what happened, and so on. Finally, whenever historians look at these events, not just the historians, the lawyers, the people involved, victims, and so on, there's the desire to create sort of a final story, to hold people accountable, to find out what really went wrong, what the cause of this was, who's to blame, what is the specific narrative, and so on. And that will take a very long time, from looking at the Exxon Valdez spill, the Tennessee coal ash spill, and all of these things. There's typically a kind of a 10, 20-year lifespan of the lawyers, the historians, everybody kind of looking into these things before some kind of a general settlement narrative comes out. And then there's always the question of whose narrative is going to dominate. The people of East Palestine, who are the victims of this, their voice is extremely important, and it's a voice that we should try to capture and record. And again, that's an invitation to some of my students who might be looking for research projects. Obviously, the corporation itself, Norfolk Southern, will have a voice. Government regulators, lawyers, lobbying on politicians. There will be a variety of people who are trying to shape the narrative of what happened. And as a historian, I'm sort of always interested in the way these different competing voices get heard or suffocated. And so I think it's important to pay some attention to that. Let me wrap up. How close am I to the bell?
You are literally a minute and 3 seconds.
Okay, so.
But then you have 2.
Yeah, so.
A minute warning.
The East Palestine derailment will have some impacts going forward. That's very clear. The environmental impacts, I think, will take many years to really understand. And as I think Ryan was saying, the movement of chemicals through a watershed can take years, right? You said before, necessarily we might see some of the impacts. So people are buying bottled water right now, but maybe they should start buying bottled water in a year, or maybe they don't need to at all, I don't know. But there's already been some impacts on policy. I know there's been quite a lot of conversation about the NTSB's regulations, federal regulations, whether there were not enough regulations, whether a certain administration shouldn't have deregulated certain things, or maybe those aren't relevant, and so on. I did notice in the press very recently, a few days ago, maybe some people saw this, there was a story about, I believe it's a natural gas company, New Fortress maybe, that's the company's name, who applied for a permit to the Biden administration to move liquid natural gas cars by rail from somewhere in Pennsylvania to the New Jersey coast. And their permit was denied, supposedly on the basis that there are extraordinary potential risks. So already, and I don't know whether that permit denial would have happened if not for the East Palestine accident. So there are already ways in which this is kind of rippling out. The degree to which it ripples out, the degree to which it kind of becomes sort of a landmark, will depend on all the sorts of things I've been talking about. Let me sort of end by saying that I, again, kind of draw attention to the fact that this is one of those moments where we kind of get the opportunity to think a bit more soberly about the kinds of technologies we have, what we do with them, what their human impacts are, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
So thank you, Tal. I'm hoping there's some questions out there, but I'd like to turn the opportunity for questions or thoughts that the panel might have amongst their fellow speakers, and see if there's anything there that you want to expand upon or ask a question on that might have coordinated or come together with some of the things that you're working on.
I would just add one thing to what Brian was just speaking about in terms of that there is already some policy movement, and I'd even call it like a silver lining to this disaster. The fact that there's this bright spotlight that's put on train safety as a result of this. People are questioning, are the regulations that are in place sufficient? Because the fact is, train derailment is surprisingly common. That there's more than 1,400 train derailments every year. So more than 3 a day happen, right? And obviously most of them are minor. Most of them don't involve environmental spills. But there's 1,400, right? And so there's obviously room for improvement. And so one thing that has happened because of the vast amount of media attention that has been put on this, and people are considering, like, is current regulations sufficient, is you see bipartisanship, actually, right? Where J.D. Vance and Sherrod Brown, who don't agree on literally anything, got together and put forward a bill that increases the level of regulations called the Railway Safety Act. That has, I don't need to go into all the details, but it does increase the number of people that have to be on board to at least 2. Increases the number of materials that would be classified as hazardous, increases the fines that would be imposed to freight companies, train companies, if there is derailment and if there is a spill. And so the fact that there is some movement and some additional consideration that has been put in place, I think is a positive thing from society's perspective.
There was a national train strike about to happen recently, rail strike, and Congress got involved and stuff like that. I think this happening fairly soon after that kind of focuses attention very much on those sort of things. So sometimes the context in which something happens is very important. The Cuyahoga River, as people know, caught fire, I think it was 1969, and it was all over the headlines everywhere, and it became a kind of a big moment in environmentalism in the US. But the fact is that the Cuyahoga River had caught fire many times before, and nobody seemed to care. So when something happens, the context in which it happens is always very important. And this happening shortly after, there was a lot of attention given to conditions in the rail industry, and whether or not people are getting sufficient rest time, downtime, holidays, whether there's sufficient people on the trains and so on. I think that the juxtaposition of those things is important.
One of, as I was going through and researching this and trying to find sources of information, I had spoken to, off the record, I can't remember if the role was conductor or engineer, and I don't know the technical terms of what each one does on a train, but they traveled this route. They know that line there, and he had mentioned to me is that potential strike, and one of the things that they were trying to negotiate and bargain for was more safety things. Now, I have not dug into all the specifics of that, but I do know when I spoke to him, he addressed the concern that they had about rail lines wanting to move to a one-person crew, and they have in the trains, the technical term is slipping my mind now, it's like a kill switch. Basically, they have to have, I think, their foot on this almost like a gas pedal. If it lifts, the train will stop. And you know, the concern with that being, you know, if you only have one person on the train, like, people have medical emergencies from time to time, you know, you wouldn't have anybody else present to do anything about it. I do know that the legislation that's been proposed would prevent that from being able to happen, but the question is that legislation going to actually come to the floor for a vote and pass, which to my knowledge, we have not reached that point yet. And a concern that I have going forward is that if the pressure starts to fall off, are we actually going to see the needed changes implemented? Because it's a long process from what the former head of the FRA had told me. It's a very long and tedious process, and it could take years if that's the route that has to be taken to get those regulations in place.
Did you say that that they're increasing the number of people who have to be on operating the train? There has to be at least one?
So the Railway Safety Act, the one that was put forward by Sherry Brown and J.D. Vance. So currently it could be one. It could only be one. And so if this passes, it would have to be a minimum of at least two.
That's just insane. And also, you were saying that that the operator has to be pushing on a kill switch. Well, what if the operator, needs to, or human needs, whatever. I mean, that's just crazy.
Yeah, it's my understanding that was a direction that they were hoping to go in potentially, as whether, I don't know the rationale, cost cutting efforts or whatnot. It's a lot cheaper to pay one person to do it than to have multiple people on there. But that I can't speak to. I do know though that there, as far as my knowledge goes, there was not really a strict regulation on how many people have to be on the trains.
Sorry, here and then the gentleman in pink, is that
I was curious about sort of the lack of a sufficient clay layer, and if that was any consequence of industry in the area. I think it's a region that was known for ceramic production at one point, right? So I didn't know if maybe the lack of that clay layer was a reflection of this. I don't know if anyone knows anything about that or can speak to that at all.
I might be best.
You probably
yeah.
So this area is all glacial till. So the clay that's there is geologically pre the glacial material that was pushed in from Canada. So there is clay really deep. And as you rise south, that clay seam becomes more apparent as you move up Highway 7 towards Rogers. So there's clay, but what's unfortunate is the nature of the geologic or the glacial material means it's really porous. There's lots of sands and lots of gravels, which allows lots of percolation. If that clay that Ryan was discussing was over top of that, it would act as an impervious barrier. So we don't have that there. So looking at where some of those watersheds were, the watershed that was most impacted, not the one that would have been the water source for the community, may have had a little bit of that clay, but we also know that this area was heavily mined for its sands and gravels, which then could have moved a lot of that material down into towards that clay layer, then protecting anything below. And that's sort of some of the stuff that we just don't know about. We have to look at some of those maps and some of those models to appreciate the susceptibility of it. Yeah. But again, like Ryan was saying, matter of feet sometimes makes an enormous amount of difference, and this is a point source problem that has a lot of movement because of where, how those hills lay and then the nature of the flow of the subterranean water. So, where that's going to go in, 100 feet, it could be radically different.
And in that area, the groundwater flow where the derailment happened is fortunate for the town. The flow is supposed to be moving away from where the intake is for those wells. I believe it's a park that's located there, which is where they keep most of their wells that are pooling the water. However, when all of those chemicals spilled, they entered Sulphur Run and Leslie Run, and that creek flows very close to that intermanagement zone. So whether or not any chemicals could have seeped in, I don't know the specifics on how that works, but it did pool some chemicals a little closer than where the actual derailment happened. But among the most concerning, because when I started digging into this, again, not a chemist, so I really went down a rabbit hole, and I was most concerned with the vinyl chloride, as everybody else was. And that is considered something called a dense non-aqueous phase liquid. And what that means in simplest terms, maybe you know more about this than I do, it's more dense, and if it enters the ground, it's not really going to try and disperse out, it's just gonna sink. But the existence of that in the liquid state when it's being transported, I don't think it's typically liquid, it's more a gas is what my understanding was. So it was somewhat unlikely that it entered the ground, that burned off as they lit the fire, but the location where that derailment happened, there are private wells in that area. Those would be the ones I think that have the most concern of whatever entered the ground, especially after they covered contaminated soil to open the track back up, and then it took a minute before they were ordered to remove those tracks and remediate all of that soil that they left in there after we had a freeze-thaw cycle and precipitation.
Sorry, here and then there.
Actually, go ahead, I'm sorry. My question, I think it's probably more for Dr. Sullivan, is comparatively like how McDonald's operated with their hot coffee, do you think Norfolk Southern kind of use that as a business practices with deregulation? They're going to probably cut corners, that they would just essentially know with how many derailments that you mentioned, that they're probably going to get sued over it, but it's probably cheaper for them to do that than it is to maintain the rail lines. You think that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point. I don't know the McDonald's hot coffee.
Well, they sued them for making coffee.
Yeah.
Too hot, and you knew
right.
that.
I mean, the fact is that private companies are profit maximizing, and that's why we need regulation, right? And so they take actions that if it increases their profits, even if it's potentially harmful to society, that's what most companies would still choose to do, which is why we need proper regulations to ensure that while maximizing profits, they're not taking actions and cutting corners that could potentially impact society. Yeah.
My apologies to both the
Oh,
gentlemen.
thank you. My original question was going to be about the wheel bearing itself, but I think the panel has maybe the bigger view, all of you are more involved in the overall view, but you brought up a good point just now. I was wondering what was contained in that car. Was it a gaseous? I don't know if it was in pellet form, like a lot of that stuff is in pellet form, or was it liquid? You're able to, like when you said in introduction, a lot of this is tied up in the courts, maybe you can't discuss it or...
They released a manifest of what was on the cars and the number of cars that had either a leak coming, that they spilled the load that was in there. It would take me a minute to dig for it to find it, but I can't remember if it lists what state it's in. It's my understanding, based on the chemical properties of vinyl chloride, that I think in order for it to exist as a liquid, it's like some crazy cold temperature that you would have to be at, which leads me to believe that it's in a gas. But I know it was carried in one of those tank cars that's pressurized, and that was one of the other things that the NTSB is digging into, is the pressure release valves and whether or not there was a malfunction with those.
Can I ask what I was going to ask? When I came in, I thought I was going to ask about the wheel bearing, because the night after that happened, they said it could have been the bearing, and then they're supposed to be changed every 300,000 miles, and I was waiting for them to come up with their maintenance records. It shouldn't be hard for them to determine when, and then maybe it was a faulty bearing, and I'm sure that'll come up in the course that Norfolk Southern's going to go after the manufacturer of the bearing, probably if that was it. And they even had a photograph of the thing on fire. I don't know if that was just an example, or did they actually have a photograph of when that wheel was on fire going by? How about you know?
It was captured from where one of the hot bearing detectors is located, is right outside of the Freshmark plant in Salem. I think that's like a meat packaging facility. And I believe it was that business's security cameras that had captured images of it back in Salem. That's about 20 miles of rail line before it got to East Palestine. We had received, I think it was like Ring camera or someone's personal like doorbell camera footage showing as it went through New Waterford, you could also see the flames and the sparks coming from underneath the train. So it was a roughly 20-mile stretch at least that there were issues with that.
I apologize, I don't monopolize, I could talk to midnight about this. When they quit putting cabooses on trains, if there was somebody in a caboose, they'd have saw that before it even got to East Palestine, if they saw it in Salem. Of course, the train would have to slow down, but you guys brought up so many terrific issues, we could discuss this for a long time.
Yeah, there's a lot to dig into.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Right here and then right here.
I've heard like 911 systems might be dependent on funding, local funding or referendum to have those in place. So is it up to individual communities to have the resources available to respond to something like this or mitigate the effects of it or prevent it? Or, is there a lot of inequity that might exist along the line?
Are you referring to like your local first responders specifically?
Yes.
So all of the EMAs in the state, I can speak on behalf of the Northeast Ohio section. We all are pretty close knit, and we have type 1 teams, type 1 hazmat teams. The closest one is Summit County, and I know I was not involved in the actual response to the derailment. However, I know there were a plethora of different hazmat teams, not just specific to the Columbiana County hazmat team. So all they would have to do is put in a request for mutual aid, and then we're pretty open across the region to help assist with that.
Okay, thank you.
Brian mentioned inaccuracies, and this is for all panelists. But, do you think that rightly or wrongly, one party is controlling the narrative?
Personally, I think from what I've seen so far, there are clearly competing narratives. There's a lot of material online where people from East Palestine are being interviewed and are talking and so on. Ultimately, some people have a lot of money and a lot of lawyers, and some people don't have so much money and don't have such good lawyers. So I think it's clear that different voices are speaking at the moment, but that in the long term, what's going to be the final sort of the legal wrap up, and what's going to be the general kind of consensus that will be in the history books or whatever. That may be. To be honest, I think it will include multiple voices. I think that's kind of where the academic disciplines are these days. We tend to listen to multiple voices. I think it's particularly in legal situations that the larger money interests will probably speak more loudly.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that. I think just the level of, the intense level of attention that this generated didn't allow any single party to dominate the conversation. And so I view it as, you do have Norfolk Southern making their case. They are in some ways lobbying against like the Railway Safety Act that's been put forward, or at least parts of it. But I think the fact that this generated so much attention from the media from different sides, politically, but I don't think any one side has been able to dominate the conversation.
Yeah, I think from our end, our information that comes from Norfolk Southern comes through their spokespeople, and that's, you can do as much as you can of information that is public record that exists in freedom of information requests, but some of the regulations and in particular the logistics of how railroads are operated, it's information that they're not obligated to share with us. While railroads are part of, I believe they're federally protected, the rail line itself operates those. I tried for weeks to get them to give me the information on where these hot bearing detectors were. I sent a text message to the individual. Now, I later learned that they preferred communication through email, which is fine, but I also know that they were texting with our newsroom and people in there trying for stuff that they were doing that they wanted us to be aware of. So I know that my text had to have been seen, and it was ignored. When we were doing the story looking into the hot bearing detectors, the only way that I found those, they didn't tell me where they were. So through doing searches of what those things look like, I was able to find the one that was referenced in the NTSB report in East Palestine. I knew it was close. East Palestine is small. Once I found that, I had to look at the mile markers that were referenced in that report that gave the approximate locations, and I literally used Google Earth and point by point mapped out the distance from one to the other, then looked at the images on a satellite view to find what I thought looked like one, and then the reporter who was here earlier, Jen, during the day went out to look and see if what I was seeing was actually the detectors, which we found. And that led us to discovering that there was reference in materials for, there's all kinds of stuff online, but there were references to a equipment detector that was in Columbiana. We began reaching out to them about that, asking them, you know, can you tell us more about this? Because we were there and we don't see it, but your materials, you know, and other materials that exist reference this being there. They told us, oh sure, we'll get back to you on that. We sent a follow-up. We have about 90% of the answer, we'll get back to you on that, which I don't quite know what that means, how you have 90% of an answer. That's just my personal opinion on that, but we'll get back to you. We reached out again, telling them, hey, you know, we're getting ready to air this piece. We've put this together. We want to give you another opportunity to comment on what we're doing. Didn't respond to us, said that, oh, we'll get back to you. We air the story. It's a second story that I have pulled up over there. And then about 2 hours after it airs, I suddenly have a response from them on that detector, that location. So I don't think there's any control of the narrative. I think there's potentially, and I can't say definitively this is what they're doing because they have people coming at them from all different directions, but I do think there may be a tendency to try and hold off on answering questions that they may not want to answer and hope that it goes away or the narrative changes or something else comes up, because that's the nature of what we live in. Unfortunately, you know, narratives that are in the news are not going to stay the main story of the news for very long.
I will say from an economic development standpoint, we have to be pretty neutral. We have to help these businesses. So we came in and we started working from Columbus, Cleveland on down, and from the state level to the federal level, people were there to help us. It didn't matter where they came from, what political background they were a part of. They were there to help and to start meeting with the residences and the businesses. So, so far I have been very happy with the response that we have gotten from everybody trying to help East Palestine, trying to help Columbiana County. They are there to meet with the businesses. When we tell them, they make it a point in their schedule to be there the next day to meet with those businesses and find out how they can help, what their needs are. So from that side of things, because that's what I work with so much, I have been impressed with the response to help economically.
So thanks. There's one at the back of the room, and then
I just had a quick question. How do the panelists feel you should try to balance the two things? Like the one thing of trying to bring attention to this is a real disaster and maybe try to find ways this doesn't happen in the future. And then the other side, how to maybe destigmatize for the businesses and for the people that are trying to move on that live in East Palestine. I know like East Palestine schools try to put air and water quality results on their website because people will refuse to go to sporting events from outside of the area, and of course people are backed out of buying homes. And so we're trying to bring attention to this, but there are people in the area that are like, we just want to go on with our lives, and how do you try to balance that?
It's a really good question. I mean, like, really good. Because yeah, I don't know the best way to. I don't think there is a recipe to destigmatize, right? Because it is just based on you know, perception and the fact that it did generate so much media attention. You can't just you know, somehow erase that stigma that already exists. And And so I do think, if anything, it is like a localized destigmatization, if there is one, that you can try to provide assurances to the people who are most impacted, those in the community, by frequent testing and assurances and just making sure that those who would be impacted if there is any type of contamination are not, and they feel safe. But beyond that, I don't know how to change the narrative, like around the country, to make people feel secure, or that East Palestine would not be associated with this train derailment in the future.
And it's not just East Palestine. Just, for example, the Sheepfold Houses is a website, and they had a house from Youngstown on the website.
Yeah.
And people were commenting all from out of state, saying, "Oh, that's only 30 miles from East Palestine, who would want to live there?" And I thought, like people really have that from outside of the area.
It does extend
stronger
beyond
perception maybe than even here.
Yeah.
So I just wondered how you thought that, bring attention, but don't scare everybody off. How does that happen?
That's a really tough one. I work with a fellow named Hunter Morris, who's a planner. Hunter? And a few years ago, we were working together, and what he had stated was coming out of a whole bunch of different dogmas, Buddhism, Christianity, almost all of those Torah, all of those doctrines basically go back to when there is a problem in a community. It generally takes 3 generations for that stigma to go away. And I feel like that's Youngstown, right? When Youngstown's sort of at that 3-generation mark, and I feel like that stigma of Youngstown is sort of melting away finally. I don't know that for certain. I know that as somebody who's come in as a foreigner to Youngstown, but there's definitely been a big, big difference between when I arrived and almost 20 years later. There seems to be a levity now, and I think that that's because the young people are like, that's not my story, I get to create my new narrative.
My thought would be that comes through advocacy and awareness. Is my general opinion on that. As time goes forward, you're going to have all of this monitoring going on. Like, those results need to be out there. You need to eventually, I think, an advocacy group that's advocating on behalf, like, hey, we're here, we're living our lives, we're hopefully fine and everything's going well. Like, that's where I think that term comes from. And as you were saying there too, like, Youngstown's always kind of had this reputation. I do. This is where I grew up. I'm here. I love it here. Like, my money goes so much further here than it could go somewhere else. The cost of buying a house is way more affordable than it is. And I think it's those things and bringing them to the forefront. And, I don't know how you combat that on a national level, but I just think that advocacy and those types of voices are the ones who ultimately lead to that type of change. It's just an opinion.
Good. I think I see 2 more hands, but I think Travis is first.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you think there's an attempt to control the narrative around potential long-term health consequences, in particular on results of testing, blood testing. I understood that 2 people in that area have tested positive for carcinogens in their blood. And it just seems like kind of a silence around that. And that, to me, that's the thing that people are really scared of. I mean, the loss of 10% of your home value you can make up over a lifetime. Long-term health consequences you can't. Maybe not even in your children.
I know that we had run stories on, I think, the 2 individuals who had come forward with it, and I believe it was vinyl chloride that they had tested for. And that, personally, that is a curiosity of my own, looking at the ways that exposure comes, because it was my general thought, the area that I understood that they lived in. To me, I'm curious how their exposure came, because they were outside of, I believe, where any of the smoke plume would have been driven based on the winds through that. And I don't know if there was municipal water supply they were getting it from, or a private well, but I know the municipal water supply has been tested so much, and I think those results are public, as far as I know. I don't really think that anyone's in my opinion, controlling that narrative, I think that it's perhaps just not been as heavily dug into yet at this point. That would be my thought, but I don't know. I don't think that there's control going on of that per se. Like, I don't even know if they know exactly where that came from, if they've done testing of their own water supply and where their supply comes from.
Yeah, I mean, I was under the impression that some local health organizations were reluctant to conduct large-scale blood testing for unspecified reasons. I just let it go with that.
That would be news to me as well. And if that is the case, if there's proof of that, like, please bring it to us, because that story.
I will look into it. I have your email.
Yes, you do. Think about all the emails that went back and forth. I think we'll take one more question for now, because we are at 1:15. If the panel is available and willing to take any other questions after that, I'll leave it up to them. But as we are wrapping up and we're going to take that last question, I want to thank everybody in the panel for their time, their ability to meet with us after hours during a really busy period of time. I know Ryan's probably going to run off to the station almost immediately when we get out of here, so I know this is the middle of this busy day. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I would love to see more panels like this. I think that's, like AJ had said, this is really what universities should be doing. And so if we can facilitate that, let's bring that together.
Thank you for organizing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this needed to happen, definitely.
That's okay. You know, when you're 72 years old, you have a lot of things to say and a lot of opinions. I was going to say something about what you said about it takes 2 or 3 generations to lose, but people are sick of hearing me talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, everyone.